Good afternoon. Welcome back to the B&H event space. Today we are learning how to photograph the Milky Way. A huge thank you to Sony for hosting today's event. And Autumn Schrock must have seen my pictures from my last trip to the Southwest and decided that this guy needs help. Autumn, welcome. It's been a while. How have you been?
I've been great. Lots happened since I've been on, but it's always great to be back on the event space. So thanks for having me.
Of course, always good to have you. And I know you've been busy. We always follow along your travels on Instagram. Today, taking it to the skies with the Milky Way. So if you guys don't have a notepad, get one, tune in, pay attention, ask your questions. And Autumn, I'll see you in a bit for some Q&A.
Cool. Well, hello, everyone. Thanks so much for tuning in. For those of you who don't know me, again, my name is Autumn Schrock. I'm lucky enough to be a Sony ambassador, and I am very, very excited to chat about Milky Way photography with you today. Astrophotography is my favorite type of photography, and I think it's one of the most challenging forms of photography, which in turn, I think makes it one of the most rewarding as well. There's so much prepping and planning that goes into taking a single shot. So I am warning you, if you've never done Astro before, it's highly addictive. So say goodbye to your precious sleep schedule, but it'll be all worth it, I promise. But hopefully this presentation will help make Milky Way photography a little less intimidating and a little more approachable. So let's get right to it. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, hopefully you can see that.
Looks good.
And cool. So first, let's cover the preparations. It would be amazing if you could just stroll out your door on a random day to shoot the Milky Way, but that's not quite how it works on this planet anyway. But so there are quite a few things to figure out first. Thankfully, there are numerous tools at our disposal that help make it a little bit easier to go through those planning and preparation stages. So there are 4 important things to take into consideration before you even head out your door. So weather, light pollution, moon phase, and the Milky Way position. So first up, we've got weather. You need clear skies in order to see outside of our world, right? So obviously weather will be one of the most important considerations that you need to take, or sorry, most important factors that you need to take into consideration. You could have the perfect shot lined up, but if it's cloudy, unfortunately, there's just not much that you can do about it. But I use a couple of reliable weather apps that help me to better predict cloud prediction, or cloud, I guess, cover. First is Windy, and then the other is Mountain Dash Forecast. Really quickly, I know I just screen shared this presentation, but I'm going to walk you through these apps really quickly just to give you an idea. So this is Windy. There's a website as well as phone apps, so you can always take it with you. But I've found with Windy specifically that it is much more accurate than your typical weather app, like Apple Weather or AccuWeather. I don't know exactly how it's so much more accurate, but I feel like every time I use it, I'm like, oh yeah, Windy was right. So first things first, on the landing page, you'll see these little like dots kind of moving around, and this is showing, shocker, the wind speed. It is called Windy after all. So we can just see like the wind direction and speed. But if we go over to the side here, the sidebar, there are several different layers that we can overlay. So clouds is the one that I use the most. This gives us a nice little cloud map. We can hit the play button down here in the bottom left corner to see sort of how those clouds are going to move and how they're going to develop. But then even more, if we go into the menu over here on the top right, we can see it expands even more layer options for us, which is cool. And if we scroll down to clouds, we can see high clouds, medium clouds, low clouds. You can even see fog, which is really cool. Obviously, there's not any fog in Utah right now, but so I highly recommend playing around with Windy. And using it when you're preparing for when you want to go out to shoot the Milky Way. The next is mountain-forecast.com. And this app is better for if you're going to be somewhere that's a little more remote and maybe there's not a weather station that's going to be nearby. Because if you're in the mountains, which is where I like to take a lot of my Milky Way photos, it'll pull information from the closest weather station, and often those are going to be very different predictions than what's happening actually in the mountains, because mountains create their own weather. So if you just type in the top search bar here, whatever mountain you choose, I went with Mount Rainier because it's my favorite mountain, but then also it's the background of my presentation, and I'm going to be chatting about Mount Rainier a bit, so I thought this one would make sense. As we scroll down, really cool, we can see on the left-hand side different forecasts for the different elevations of the mountain, which I think is pretty neat. So if we go down to the base of the mountain, obviously the temperatures are going to be a bit higher. It's going to be raining there, I guess. But I have found this app to be pretty accurate as well. It doesn't have quite as many like cool features and overlays like what Windy has, but it does have accurate information for those places that don't have other weather stations. So highly recommend both of those. Then we'll hop back into the presentation. So basically, for weather, it's important to just have patience. It's specifically important, I guess, with mountain weather as well, because like I said, they create their own mountains and the weather can change very, very drastically, very quickly as well. So this was at Mount Rainier National Park, and it is, being one of the most massive mountains that we have in the lower 48, it creates its own weather and it's really tough to predict. And so this was early evening. The apps had said earlier on that it was going to be clearer, but I just couldn't believe it when I was looking at these views. Like, it looked like your typical January Seattle day. The mountain was very much not out. I got to a crossroads in the trail. I waited around for what felt like forever and finally made the decision, well, I don't feel like anything's actually going to happen. It's getting close to sunset time. So I made the decision to go back to my car. This was the most that I saw Mount Rainier the entire day, just a little sliver. And of course, like 15 minutes after I started driving, I started to see stars pop out, and I pulled over and I got out of my car and I shrieked almost in excitement, but mostly in frustration as I began to see the Milky Way peeking out of the clouds. So I drove back up to the trailhead, marched myself back up the trail. I got as far as I could until the Milky Way aligned over the mountain. It's not where I wanted to be positioned, of course, because I left and then came back. But the sky had somehow miraculously cleared up completely in like an hour. And I don't really understand exactly how that happened so quickly, but learn from my mistakes. If something like windy or mountain forecast says that it's going to clear up later, be patient because odds are that it's going to happen. And actually, fun fact, this is the first Milky Way photo that I ever took at Mount Rainier. I haven't re-edited it or anything. It's actually one of the first Milky Way photos I ever took. Is it perfect? No, but it's important to be able to look back at your older work and appreciate it and realize that, everyone has to start somewhere. But I digress. The moral of this specific story is to utilize the tools at your disposal and to have patience. It's not just an astrophotographer's greatest tool, but an all-around nature photographer's greatest tool as well. And clouds aren't necessarily something to shy away from either. Of course, there's a fine line between too many clouds and a good amount of cloud, but despite what happened to me in my previous story, the clouds don't always completely clear, but they can help to create some interesting and unique shots. Like in this one, the clouds, they mask a decent amount of the Milky Way, but they also add a lot of depth to the image. You can kind of see some of the stars peeking through and they get kind of this nice glow because of the cloud, which just makes it different. It's more dynamic, and it's not really a shot that you see of, the Milky Way very often. Light pollution from cities drowns out stars. So you'll need to head somewhere more remote that has dark skies optimal for Milky Way photography. I use a website which is very aptly named Light Pollution Map. No idea how they came up with that name, but it's an online light pollution map for visibility and defining the darkest skies. Luckily, I live in Utah now, so there are plenty of dark sky sites around me, which is great. But if you're in, like, say, New York, it's going to be tougher to find darker skies for the Milky Way, and you'll have to travel a bit further. So I will go ahead and pull up light pollution map for you. So right off the bat, it just kind of plops us to where our location is. So we can see I'm in Salt Lake City. All the bright colors are where there's light pollution. Once it starts to get into this like red and lavender kind of like lilac color, you're not going to be seeing stars even, definitely not the Milky Way, but definitely not even stars. And so as we zoom out, we can see basically the entire eastern half of the US is pretty light polluted. So if you're in, this sort of New York region, it's going to be tough. If you're, in sort of like Virginia, West Virginia, there are a few options there, but you're going to have to be traveling a bit to the west if you're on the East Coast. And this is a global map, which is cool. So we can go to like Europe, and Europe is pretty much going to be tricky. But yeah, so it's a cool map to play around with. Definitely recommend it. And we'll hop back in. Okay. Moon phase is next. That's one of my absolute favorite photography subjects. If you're familiar with my work at all, you're probably tired of seeing me post Happy Moon Day, but I don't care because I love the moon and I love Happy Moon Day. But anyway, so the reflected sunlight that comes off of the moon is surprisingly bright enough that it will drown out stars and it'll drown out the Milky Way, similar to the city light pollution. So I usually aim for about new moon to quarter moon in terms of the moon phase when I'm trying to photograph the Milky Way. A lot of people think that you have to shoot during new moon and that's it, but I actually like a little moon sometimes. It can help illuminate your foreground if you're taking single shots, so you'll get rid of some of that foreground noise, or maybe if you want some more detail in your foreground instead of a silhouette. But of course, having a silhouetted subject is a compositional and artistic choice, which just means that it depends on what you're looking for. But sometimes the moon can make for a fun element to include in your Milky Way shots too. So this is a single photo that I took, again, at Mount Rainier National Park. And so you don't have to completely shy away from the moon. And I encourage you to be creative and see how you can incorporate both the Milky Way and the moon in a photo yourself. But in order to find that, you're probably like, I have no idea where the moon's going to be. I have no idea how to find, like how to figure out where it's going to rise or set. And that is something that I would recommend using the app PhotoPills for. And I'll go through that in just a bit. But like I said, I think having a little bit of moon can be really nice. Last and certainly not least, we need to know the Milky Way position, where the Milky Way is going to be. So most photographers look for the core of the Milky Way because there's a higher density of stars and gas clouds that make it appear brighter in the night sky. In order to see the Milky Way core, you need to make sure that it's the right time of year for your location. So here in the Northern Hemisphere, you'll want to look toward the southern horizon. It'll be a little more southeastern in about March or April, and then you can view it through September, and in September it'll be a little bit more southwestern. If you're in the southern hemisphere, a little bit better off. You get to see it from February through October, and in June and July it's directly overhead, which I think just looks really cool. In the northern hemisphere, the core is pretty low to the horizon. But the great thing about the Milky Way is that it's predictable. You know where it's going to be and when. It doesn't change for the most part. Not like something like the aurora, which you have no idea how to predict accurately. which that's also one of my favorite photography subjects. But anyway, so like I said, I use an app called PhotoPills, and I'm sure many of you have heard of that, or maybe many of you actually even use that. And it's great for lining up where the Milky Way will be. So let's hop into PhotoPills, and I'll give you like a brief rundown of how I use the app to figure out where I need to be for the Milky Way. Can hear my cat meowing. He wants in the door. So cute. He would destroy this though. Okay. So in PhotoPills, when you first open the app, you'll come into this sort of main menu screen, and we want the planner, which is the top left icon. So we'll tap to click into that. And then it sort of drops you into this map view. You can tap and press on the map anywhere to set your location. I put mine where I took the photo of Mount Rainier. That is the background of the presentation. And then at the top, you can see there's a gray bar. We've got some information there, and we can swipe through here, and I'll swipe to show you in just a second. And then at the very bottom, we've got this blue-orange, kind of light blue gradient. And this is our time scrubber. If we tap and swipe through, we can see the time below it is changing. Then there's a menu bar at the bottom, and I won't get into that because I don't have nearly enough time. This app is very powerful, but so say I'm at the orange pin on the map and I want to photograph the Milky Way, and I don't know where it's going to line up. This is how I can figure that out. So in the top bar, you'll notice there's in the gray bar, there's like a darker gray box with a little icon inside of it next to the words sun and moon. We can tap on all of these icons as we are scrubbing through, and it'll do different things. So I don't want to worry about the sun shadows or anything, so I'm going to swipe through to the next one. This one is how you plan for the moon. So if I tap the little icon in the top left, it'll bring up this black pin as well. That basically is telling me the distance, and it'll tell me height, altitude difference, etc. I'm not really worried about that right now. I want to worry about the Milky Way, so I'm going to keep swiping through. But this one I am wanting to know about, the moon. So we've got the moon phase, and then if we tap again the little icon to the top left where it says sun and moon, we get all of these colored lines that show up. So the yellow line represents where the sun rises, orange is sunset, and then the light blue is the moonrise, and the dark blue is moon set. And you can see as we scrub through that time scrubber at the bottom, the bar kind of moves throughout the day. This is just showing us the sun's location right now, and then we get into golden hour and then blue hour and then nighttime. But we can see like nothing's showing up for the Milky Way, so we have to keep going through. So right now it says the moon phase is last quarter, so that's okay. I would say it might be edging on a little bit too much moon, but as we keep going, we can get the specific sunrise and moonrise and set times. Then if we swipe another time, we get all of the different blue hour times, then blue hour and golden hour. And then finally, we get into the Milky Way. So visibility GC, that stands for galactic core. And if we tap the icon next to that, those little dots, we get this arc that shows up. And this is what represents the Milky Way. We can see the dots at the bottom are larger, and that represents the Milky Way core. So as I'm scrubbing through, I'm going to go to maybe the orange, you can see it a little bit better. So now we have a light gray bar and a dark gray bar, and the light gray bar is the Milky Way core rising, and then the dark is its setting. And so as I go through nighttime, I can kind of see where the Milky Way is going to line up. And if I zoom in a little bit more, I can see that from where my position is, that orange pin, if I'm scrubbing through, it's not going to line up over the mountain like I want it to. So that means I either need to move my location, the orange pin, somewhere else, or if I scrub through the time bar at the bottom, maybe at a certain point it'll line up. I know because I've already been there that the Milky Way rises over the mountain later in the year. So at the time bar at the bottom right now, it says 1:05. If I tap on that little clock, it'll bring up date and time, and I can set whatever I want. So let's go into, I think I took that photo like early September. So let's just go like September 9th. We'll see what that looks like. That's pretty close. So now we can see the gray, the orange is, I feel like, easier to see. The gray bar, the light gray bar and the dark gray bar now kind of frame the crater of Mount Rainier, which is that little circle. So now if I'm going through, I'm swiping and I can see right at about 1018, looks like, the Milky Way will rise directly over the mountain. So that's basically good for aligning. And then if we swipe one more at the top, we see the galactic center, which is the core. The light blue bars that are next to the word galactic center in that top section there, once those are all the way full, that means we'll see the most detail in the Milky Way. As the moon starts to get bigger and bigger, the blue bar will start to go down. And then that means that the moon's drowning out a little bit more and more of the Milky Way. So once that bar gets like to this level, I'm usually not shooting because that's you're just losing more detail. And that's pretty much it in terms of photo pills. I mean, there's so much more that you can do with this app. It's incredibly powerful, but I don't have the time to go through all of that. So if you, like, as I was going through that, if you're like, I have no idea what she's doing, I'm so lost, that's totally okay. It took me a while to figure out the app, but the great thing that I love about PhotoPills is they have a ton of tutorials on their website that walk you through everything in probably more detail than I just did. So if you're curious, I would definitely recommend checking that out. Okay, so taking into consideration all four of these preparations will just help make your life a lot easier and will allow you to come up with more fun and unique shots. Now let's get into some gear. You don't need top of the line gear to shoot the Milky Way, but it definitely has to be Sony gear. No, I kid, just a little bit though. There are certain requirements to keep in mind, though, that will make a big impact when you're shooting. So next, you need a camera body, of course, but you also need a camera body that is able to operate in manual shooting mode, which means that you have full control over the exposure. So over the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO. You'll need wide angle lenses that have fast apertures. So think like 12 millimeters to 35 millimeters, and then like f1.2 to f2.8. And a sturdy tripod. And don't forget to take it with you because I have done that. So please learn from my mistakes again. And I'm going to quickly just walk you through the gear that I'm currently using. So for camera body, I'm using the Sony Alpha 1 and the Sony A7R5. I love both of these bodies for different reasons, really. They're both fantastic. They're both higher resolution, which used to mean not good in low light, but luckily with these newer cameras that are coming out, that Sony's coming out with, they're really great, surprisingly, in low light. Like both of these are, 50 megapixels plus and are doing super well in low light. So that's great. With the Alpha 1, we've got a little bit more in terms of versatility. We've got like the speed, if you're into like sports or any wildlife or anything as well. It's definitely Sony's flagship camera for a reason. It's a professional level body, that's for sure, but I think it is so worth it. And I loved it so much that I bought two of them. And the Sony A7R5 is, this screen is like just the selling point where we've got the flip out screen, but then it also flips, this direction as well. Love it. But honestly, both of these are just so fantastic. So highly recommend some of the newer bodies from Sony. And I have used, other bodies that I think still are fantastic. Like honestly, the Sony A7R3 is still a really great camera in low light. Like the A7 IV is another one that's really fantastic as well. So highly, highly recommend these. And in terms of lenses, my go-to is the Sony 14 millimeter f1.8 G Master. This thing is amazing. It's so light and compact for how wide and how fast it is. with the, the 1.8 being 14 millimeters. My last 14 millimeter lens before Sony came out with theirs was like twice the size and twice the weight. It was wild. So this is an incredible lens. Very few lens aberrations or lens imperfections. So there's not a lot of distortion or anything like that. It's really, really awesome. Sometimes if I'm in a certain location, I'll find that it's a little bit too wide. And in that instance, I will use my second go-to lens, the Sony 20 mm f1.8 G lens. And this is a G lens, so it's technically a step below the G Master, but I honestly feel like it's on par with other G Master lenses. So if you could only pick up one Astro lens, this would be my pick for sure. It's the best bang for your buck, and I really, really love how small it is. It's amazing for travel. So love this lens. Now, prime lenses, meaning they don't zoom, those are going to be the best bet for astrophotography because they typically will have the widest, fastest apertures, which is what we need when we're shooting at night because we want to let as much light into our sensor as possible. But with that being said, you can still use some zoom lenses. I've used the 12 to 24 millimeter f2.8 G Master lens, and that one is really great. Being able to go to 12 millimeters is fun. The 16 to 35 millimeter f2.8 G Master is a lens that my partner Nate uses a lot still. So we definitely can use zoom lenses, but I would recommend primes as being the best option. And you can use like funkier primes too, like the 50 millimeter f1.2 G Master, which is actually the lens that I'm using to stream this with right now. That one's really fun if you're wanting to play around with other things like star trails maybe, or putting it on a star tracker. So definitely you can think outside the box with your gear too. And tripod. I think that it is really, really important. I feel like I say this all the time, really important to invest in a high quality, sturdy tripod because we spend all of this money investing in really good gear. And then we often, I feel like I hear people, they skimp and buy like a $50 tripod and like it might hold your camera up. I don't know. It's kind of like if I'm going to be spending thousands of dollars, I want to make sure that it's held up by something that's very supportive and that's not going to blow over at the like first little breath of wind. So I really highly recommend investing in a sturdy tripod. So I use primarily the Colorado Tripod Company Series 2, or sorry, Centennial Series 2 carbon fiber tripod. It is pretty lightweight for like how small and compact it is, and it is really sturdy, like sturdier than some of my tripods that are twice this size. And then the Aspen ball head is such a freaking cool ball head. And I don't understand how it actually hasn't been ripped off a ton because most ball heads, when you're wanting to shoot in portrait orientation, you just have that one little slot that you can move your camera over into. But this is just the entire thing is a ball. I'm not sure if you can really see that, but you have so much more room to play with this ball head. So I absolutely recommend Colorado Tripod Company. You can just go to autumntripod.com. That's just my affiliate link, but it's an easy one to remember. But if I know that I'm going to be hiking for longer distances, or if I know that it's not going to be windy, if I check the windy.com app and I know that it's not going to be windy, then I'll bring my smaller tripod, which is the Gitzo GT1545T Traveler, I think. Yeah, GT1545T. It's kind of a mouthful, but it's a great tripod. And then I also put a Colorado Tripod Company Aspen ball head on this as well. Um, Seriously, I could do an entire event space on just this ball head. So I recommend picking one up if you can. But while this gear will give you the best results, what I've listed is certainly not an exhaustive list. Like there are definitely more affordable options out there, but just keep in mind at the cost of image quality. And I know it's definitely a fine balance, weighing in cost versus image quality, but you really can't go wrong with any of the newer Sony gear that's coming out. All right, so let's get back into presentation. and into some camera settings. So there are a few camera settings that you should set up on your camera before you head out the door, because it's always easier to adjust settings inside rather than fidgeting with them in the dark. First, might be pretty obvious, but shoot in RAW format. I'm sure most of you are familiar with RAW format. But if you're not really quickly, it's just a type of file format that contains the largest amount of detail out of any photo file type. So it's a good idea to shoot in RAW, like basically in every scenario, over JPEG, because JPEG will take some of that information and throw it out whatever it thinks is maybe not important in order to save on file space. But since we're shooting at night, we want to make sure that we're capturing and storing all of that data, because we're going to need as much as possible, since there's not a lot of light that is able to, it's nighttime, so you need as much light as possible, and we want to keep all of that data so that we can have a lot of editing latitude later on. Most cameras will let you choose compressed or uncompressed RAW, unless you're like going to be printing large files, printing large prints. I don't really think it's 100% necessary to shoot in uncompressed. You can get away with shooting in compressed RAW. I will probably choose uncompressed just because, if I ever want to print a photo, I'd like to have that option to have the detail, but I understand that file sizes are getting larger and media files are or media storage devices are more expensive, and having 1,000 hard drives is kind of a nightmare. So you can definitely shoot in compressed and get away with it. Lossless compressed is also a newer option that's coming out in a lot of cameras now. And honestly, if you were shooting in uncompressed and lossless compressed and you compared them side by side, unless you were zoomed in to like 500%, I highly doubt you'd be able to notice a difference. So lossless compressed is definitely an option as well. Next, shutter delay. Even the slightest camera movement, like just gently pressing your shutter button to take a photo, can result in a blurry photo when you're taking a long exposure, like what we're doing at night. But this can easily be eliminated by just using a remote shutter, or I just use the built-in self-timer that most cameras have. I use either 2 or 5 seconds, second delay, depending. But usually that's enough time to give your camera the space to settle down after you press the shutter to give you crisp images. Next is manual shooting mode, and like I mentioned before, this will allow you to have full control over your camera's exposure, which is what we have to do because unfortunately cameras aren't quite smart enough to expose properly at night. I'm assuming that will come at some point in our lives, but they're not quite there yet. So you'll have to adjust the aperture, shutter speed, and ISO manually. Manual focus mode. I always say the most challenging part of astrophotography is manually focusing, because we're using wide angle lenses and we're trying to focus on these little teeny tiny dots, these stars, and it can be really tough to see if the stars are in focus. But most lenses have a little like AF/MF switch on the side that you can switch to manual focus, but if not, you'll have to go into your menu and change your camera to manual focus. And some people say to focus on the brightest star in the sky, and I used to do that. That's what I was told. And I've actually found that if I choose a more medium bright star, I usually will nail focus on the first try. And I think it's because those brighter stars, those planets, sometimes will have kind of a glow around them, and it makes it a little bit harder to find that sharp edge on the side if it's like really in focus. So I personally find that finding a medium bright star is better. Sony cameras have a really cool feature called manual focus assist, where the viewfinder automatically zooms in when you change or when you move your focal ring. And it's really helpful for those of us who don't have, great night vision. Like me, I have to wear contacts or glasses all the time, so I can basically only barely see at any point. But this setting comes standard on all Sony lenses. I think it's automatically like set up when you pull your camera out of the box. But one thing that I wanted to point out that I think people often miss with this setting is When you move your focal ring and it zooms in for you, if you press the center button in the back side of the inside of your scroll wheel on the back of your camera, it'll zoom in again for you, like even further. And that is what really helps me to be able to nail focus. Another focus feature that I use is focus peaking. And this is when the camera colors the parts of your image that are in focus. So you can set this up through your menu, and you should have a few different color options that you can choose. I usually choose red because I find that it stands out really well against most environments, and especially the night sky. And it's just another helpful tool when you're trying to manually focus. But honestly, even with all of these focus assistance settings, I feel like the most important one to do, or the most important tip I can give you for manually focusing, is to just look through your electronic viewfinder. The viewfinder, I find, really just is like 10 times easier to focus than trying to look at your back screen. So that is a good tip. Next, long exposure noise reduction. This is an optional setting that you can turn off. Basically, if you've ever tried shooting a long exposure and it takes your camera a long time to process, like the back screen just has processing, what it's doing is taking a second exposure that's just black to aid in removing hot pixels. And hot pixels, if you've ever shot a long exposure at night, or really just any sort of high ISO setting, you'll notice sometimes little like colored pixels that are kind of sprinkled across your photo. And those are hot pixels. They just kind of happen from using higher ISOs and longer exposures. So your camera's not broken, don't worry. But what that setting does is kind of eliminate those for you in your camera. But I often find that I need to either preserve battery life, or I just don't have that processing time if I'm shooting like a time lapse. So I'll turn it off, but if they bother you, you can use them to remove the hot pixels instead of doing it yourself in post. But it is easy to do in post for whatever it's worth. And then last is screen brightness. A setting that I use so frequently that I've assigned a custom key on my camera is my screen brightness. Like, there's not much worse than getting to your night shooting spot. You've got, your red headlamp on, so your eyes have adjusted to the night sky. You're getting your tripod set up, your camera set up, and then you turn your camera on, and the back screen just sears your retinas. So I made the bottom button on my scroll wheel on the back of my camera my screen brightness adjustment. So I can just very quickly press that and change my brightness to all the way down or all the way up, depending on what I'm shooting. And now into exposure settings. There really are an infinite number of variables that can affect what your exposure should be. And I encourage you to experiment and play around with it, but sort of a good starting point is for aperture. I think it's generally a best practice to open up your lens all the way, to choose the widest aperture that's available for your lens. So you want, like I said, as much light as possible to hit your sensor. And so usually a range from like f1.2 to f2.8 is ideal. Some people say, to stop down a few stops for sharpness, but I honestly don't feel like I have to do that with my Sony lenses. I feel like going from 1.8 to 2.2 really doesn't change anything. So I just leave mine wide open. Shutter speed. This is my most changed variable when I'm shooting at night. I like to play around with different speeds for different effects, or if I'm like compositing or blending photos together later in post. But I'm usually using a shutter that's about 8 to 13 seconds, depending on my focal length. And it is important to note the rule of 500 here. You'd think that, well, if I need as much light as possible, shouldn't I just leave my shutter open for like a minute? But because we're on a spinning planet, you'll get something called star trails. It's when they kind of look like dashes instead of dots, and it looks a little bit weird. It looks not intentional enough. So it usually just looks like a mistake. And so what we're looking for are those like sharp little stars that basically look like squares because of the pixels of our camera when we're really fully zoomed in. And so the rule of 500 is a guide for determining your maximum shutter speed so that you don't get those star trails. And it's a really easy concept to remember if you shoot with a full frame body. Just take 500 and divide it by your focal length. And you might notice that it says 200 in parentheses next to it, because it's called the rule of 500, but it was created or it was developed for 35mm film cameras back in the day, and we have come a far, far away from that. So it's a bit of an outdated system with the higher resolution cameras that we have now. So I find that using a rule of 200 instead works for me for estimating my shutter speed. So for example, if I'm shooting with a 20mm lens on a full frame body, I just take 200 divided by 20 and I get 10 seconds. So that's the longest that my shutter speed can be before I start to get those star trails. If you're going to be shooting on a crop sensor lens, you have one more extra step, but it's still pretty easy. You need to find out what your full frame equivalent focal length is. And you do that by finding out what your camera's crop factor is. So usually this will be around 1.5, but it'll be easy to just Google whatever camera body you have and then crop factor. So you'll just take your focal length. So say I'm again shooting on like a 20mm, times the crop factor, which we'll say it's 1.5, then we get 30. So 30 is our full frame equivalent focal length. Then we take 200 divided by that 30, which gives us 6.6 seconds. So on that camera, I could shoot at 6.6 seconds before I start to introduce those star trails. And if you're going to be printing like really large photos and you want higher accuracy, because this is kind of just sort of a little bit of an estimate, there's something called the NPF rule, which is a much more complex equation. You've got aperture and you have to know what pixel pitch is, which is just the distance in millimeters between the center of two adjacent pixels. Focal length, I don't know about you, but I'm an artist and math is not necessarily my strong suit. So if I need to really get detailed on like the NPF rule, I'll just use the PhotoPills app. On the main menu screen, if you just scroll down, there's a section called Spot Stars, and it'll calculate the NPF rule for you, which is pretty cool. And now back to exposure settings. So ISO is next. Usually an ISO around like 2500 to 4000 will be sufficient when you're using an aperture of like f1.2 or 2.8. And although I've taken shots at 10,000 ISO, I've been pleased with those still. It's like with these newer low light cameras that Sony's coming out with, I don't really have to fear higher ISOs anymore. I used to think like, oh, I don't want to push my ISO up to 4000. And now it's just like, oh, 4000, that's no big deal. So that's really great news for us astrophotographers. And white balance. Okay, so I included this in the exposure settings, even though it is not part of the exposure triangle. It does not change your exposure, but that's why I gave it a little asterisk. For some reason, it helps me to remember to set my white balance when I just lump it in with my exposure settings, because I find that at least for me, like I will not remember to change it if I don't sort of like, okay, I have these 4 things that I have to do. And you can leave your white balance on auto and come away with okay shots. But often city lights or moonlight or even the color of your foreground can kind of throw your white balance out of whack. And so like this raw photo was shot in auto white balance, completely forgot that I was in auto white balance, and it shows 5250 Kelvin, which is pretty warm. And so it's really easy for the camera to get tricked into thinking it needs to warm up night shots because, they kind of look a little bit blue, right? And so it ends up looking a little bit muddy and kind of just like this orange-brown color. And it's definitely not what you see with your eyes. And while you can adjust white balance in post-processing, it'll be harder to pull out the colors of the Milky Way that are more subtle. So it's just a good idea to practice this in camera. And so I took this after I realized that my auto white balance was on. And so I usually choose custom Kelvin white balances for my astro shots. And I typically find that I'm drawn toward cooler skies. And so this one was shot at 3600 Kelvin. And so I'm often in a range of about 3500 to 4500 Kelvin, depending on the scene, of course. I'm usually closer to the lower end of that range, though, closer toward the 3500. Composition. So we've learned how to plan our shots, what gear and exposures to use, but what makes a great Milky Way photo? I often ask myself this, and it's definitely a subjective question. But for my own personal liking, I found that it's not simply having the Milky Way in frame and that's it. It's sort of all of the other elements in the photo that come together to make a harmonious image. And so when we're first getting started photographing the Milky Way, we tend to get really excited when we see it, and we just point our camera toward it and like fire away because we're just so excited we can see the Milky Way. And that is totally okay as you're learning, as you're figuring out your exposure and how to set your tripod up in the middle of the night, how to figure out how to focus. But as you progress and you're getting more comfortable with your camera at night, it's important to start thinking more intentionally about your compositions as well. So a few of the compositional elements that I like to include or utilize in my work are reflections. They're an easy way to add more visual interest to your photos. I mean, you're able to capture twice as many stars, and sometimes if you're lucky, you can even see below the water, which I think is really cool, and it just adds another layer of visual interest. So like the moon, for instance, was shining off camera here on the right-hand side, and it illuminated the sediment below the water, which I thought was a pretty cool, pleasant surprise. So that's another example, I guess, of, a little bit of moonlight can be pretty nice. Leading lines are a really great way to direct your viewer's eye around the frame, and the Milky Way is fantastic for this in general because from our perspective, the Milky Way is a line. So there are multiple different leading lines in this shot. The road kind of helps your eye up, and then the rock spire leads it up even further. And then, we've got the Milky Way here as well to lead our eyes out of the frame. And you'll also notice that in a good number of my Milky Way photos, the Milky Way is being slightly obstructed by the foreground. And by making it seem like the foreground and background are like almost interacting in some way with this overlap, it can make the whole image feel a little bit more cohesive. But that isn't always something that I do. It's not always something that you have to do either. Like in this photo, the Milky Way is close to touching the foreground, but it's not overlapping. But we still have, several of these leading lines. There's kind of like a weird V shape in the sand that kind of leads our eye up to this hoodoo, which then leads our eye up to the Milky Way and then out. And then we even actually kind of have some more leading lines here with these little wispy ribbons of clouds. Using light is a great way to emphasize leading lines. So here I used long exposures to capture a car driving through the mountain pass. And it helps to lead your eye around the frame, gives it a little bit more dimension. And it also brings in a human element, which can help the viewer imagine themselves in your photo. Same thing here, my eye is, first drawn to the car trails that lead my eye up, and then up toward the mountain, and then out through the Milky Way. And not just with car trails, but playing with light in other ways on your foreground is a nice way to bring more depth to your images. If it's allowed, of course. There are definitely some places now that are getting more strict about light painting at night. So make sure that you're Googling if that's allowed wherever you're going to be going, just in case. But this was just a happy accident where a car pulled up and illuminated the face of this rock formation, which is called the Temple of the Sun. So I felt like it was a nice little nod to the name, having this sort of seemingly sunlight on the rock. But the light itself is creating a leading line up the face, which then leads your eye up and out toward the Milky Way. Composites. So if you'd like to take it even further, depending on where you are in your Milky Way photography journey, you can get into composites or like stitching multiple photos together. And so this is a composite example of a foreground that looks north, and I really liked it, so I took a blue hour photo. And then later I took a photo looking the other direction of the Milky Way and composited it later in Photoshop. And this one is also a composite. The view of Mount Shuksan, which is another one of my favorite mountains, points due north as well. But I really love this view of the mountain, and so I wanted to see how it would look with the core behind it. And that's one of the fun things about compositing is getting these ideas in your head of how something might look, and then being able to bring it to life. So I also want you to take note of the image orientations as I'm going through these as well, because the Milky Way shifts its orientation throughout the year. And you'll notice that some images look better in portrait or landscape, depending. And of course, it's image and artist dependent. So it just kind of, it's up to the artist for sure. But there are some that kind of lend themselves better towards certain orientations. Like, for instance, the Milky Way later in the year, closer to September, which is where I shot this as well, it's pretty straight up and down. And that definitely lends itself more toward portrait orientations. Whereas when it's more leaning on its side, it can be better for landscapes. But of course, it's, like I said, it's dependent on the foreground as well as the Milky Way. And, I think that this shot could work well in both portrait or landscape orientation, because we've got sort of the up and down lines of the waterfall, but then also these kind of this side to side of the Milky Way. But adding scale is another way to help bring more depth into your photos. By adding in a person, this is my partner Nate, we can see like just how grand this landscape is. Like, without a person there, it's hard to get a grasp on just how massive this waterfall is. Another fun thing to play with is intentional star trails. So going back to that rule of 500 or 200, where we don't want any star trails, you can take it completely the opposite direction and capture the path. I guess it's more of our planet spinning than the actual stars moving themselves, but over a long period of time. So I believe this photo was around 150 separate photos that were 45 seconds each. And this is a really easy way to stitch them. Like, there's a really easy way to stitch them together in Photoshop. Or you can use separate software. I think it's called Star Stacks. It's a free software and it just stacks them all together for you. So that's pretty nice too. But here, so this is my sort of star trail process of the first photo that I took and then stacking them all together until we get to the last one. So it's just a quick little like video that showcases how they kind of move across the frame, which is pretty cool. And as you can see, a car pulled up, brought some nice headlights in. So once I got all of the star images stacked, then I went through and I removed any like satellite images or sorry, satellite lines or airplane lines. And then I did take a separate photo for the foreground as well, because I knew that I would want to bring out a little bit more detail in those red rocks. And of course, to remove those headlights. It is a little more capturing intensive, the intentional star trails. And the same thing goes for panoramas as well. You take them exactly as you would a panorama during the day, just kind of overlap your photos by about 50%. And I find that I usually take like a Z pattern. So I'll start at the top left and I'll go across and then go down and then go back and then down and then go back again. But it's kind of fun to be able to see the entire like arc of the Milky Way, which I took this photo in Arches National Park. So it's also kind of a nod to like an arch, which is a fun thing compositionally to play with too. One of my favorite things that happens at Mount Rainier is cloud inversion. Normally air temperature is warmer near the surface and colder as you go up in altitude, but during an inversion, warmer air gets trapped above the cooler air. And so you get this really cool, like kind of low fog that sometimes happens below you, which makes it this like kind of otherworldly feel because you're like literally standing above the clouds. This is just another version from a different time at Mount Rainier, and it's a blue hour blend. So I took the cloud inversion photo after the sun had set when it was blue hour. And then I took the Milky Way photo later, didn't move my tripod or camera at all, and then combined those later in post to get a clearer, like less noisy view of my foreground. A fun and unique way to photograph the Milky Way in the PNW specifically is by having it mimic the volcanoes in the area erupting. There's something painfully beautiful about the symbolism, and I think specifically of Mount St. Helens. And fun to do at Mount Rainier as well with it directly overhead. I'm not going to get too deep into editing, partly because we're running out of time and also because I'm going to be back on the event space here in a few weeks to walk you through my whole astrophotography editing process. But I'll briefly just give you a little rundown here. Post-processing can really amplify your night sky photos because the camera just isn't equipped to truly capture that complicated of a scene yet. And so basically what I do, my first step in post-processing is envisioning what I want the final product to look like. Do I want the foreground to play a key role, or do I want it to be like all about the Milky Way? And so this is a really quick clip of the edits that I made in this specific photo. So I applied noise reduction to both photos. I took a foreground exposure that you'll see come up in a second. Then I darken the city sky, the glow that's near the top of the mountain, add more contrast to the Milky Way, add a little bit of a vignette in the sky, color balance the sky a little bit, make the Milky Way and the sky like a little bit cooler, a little more magenta. I'll go back and play it again. Add contrast to the foreground and darken it to make sure that it matches the luminosity of the sky. Then I'll remove like any airplanes or hot pixels or anything like that, and then do like a few little global edits. So I'll start with here. This is where I started, which I still think is a cool shot, unedited. It's just different from what I was going for with the edit. So this is what I started with and then ended up here. So I want you to remember that art, and yes, that includes photography, is subjective. And if you like something that I've advised against or vice versa, that's perfectly okay. And in fact, I challenge you to explore, to try all sorts of settings and gear and compositions to find what you like most, because this is typically what, I find that I like. But if you've never taken a Milky Way photo before, hopefully you'll be able to apply these tips and tricks to take your first shot this summer. And if you're more of an experienced astro shooter, hopefully you are still able to find some fun tricks that you can apply to take your astrophotography even further. So again, my name is Autumn Schrock, and you can find me on all the social medias as Pops or on my website, autumnschrock.com. And I also lead photography workshops around the world with my partner, Nate Luby. You might know him on the internet as Nate in the Wild. And you can find all of our trips at inthewildworkshops.com. Okay, I know this was a lot of information to take in all at once, so please let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, I hope that you have a great day.
Thank you so much again, Autumn. You know the questions are already pouring in. Just as you start coming in drips and drabs at the end. I want to start with a question that I also had. Have you ever used an external monitor for improving focus?
Ooh, that's a really great question. I have not, but I'm wondering if, I don't know if I think for me at least, part of the viewfinder experience is that it's like blocking out everything else. Whereas like if I were looking at a monitor, I might still see like my camera screen somewhere, or like if I'm with someone else, maybe I'll see them doing something. I feel like that kind of distracts me a little bit. So for me, I think the viewfinder is probably best for me, but I might try a monitor next time now. I'm curious.
Wait until you get my age. It's like you learn to not trust your eyes. Kind of staying in that same vein, because I think there's probably I can't be the only one out there that has trouble with like manual focusing. It's like sometimes you focus to infinity, and every setup, every camera, every lens is different. Sometimes it's like you have to notch it back a little bit. I've heard people have tips where it's like, okay, test it out in the daytime, make a little mark or a little tape on the lens for where your true infinity focus point is. But when you guys
Mhm.
go out, because I'm assuming, you have no light. I know you went over like your whole setup. It's not like you're out there and you have full lighting and all the time in the world. Do you guys do test shots to make sure that you're focusing right? I mean, you don't want to go out there and spend the whole night out photographing the sky and be like, oh crap, everything's out of focus by a little bit.
Oh, absolutely. I take a lot of test shots and I take a lot of them throughout the night because knowing me, I might have like bumped my
You
lens
hit
or
it.
something and then it's out of focus. So I'm definitely taking multiple test shots throughout the night. And that also goes if I even just like move my tripod a little bit. If I'm like, oh man, did I touch my camera? I don't know. Then I'll take another one just to make sure because I have done that where I was like, okay, I got it. And then somewhere down the line, I bumped my camera or something and I got out of focus. And then the rest of the shots were all out of focus. So I'm definitely like, now I'm making sure throughout the night periodically that it's still in focus.
Smart. And I'll keep along that same vein. Another good question here. Do you use hyperfocal distance at all?
Ooh, I don't. Um, uh, I mean, for me, I feel like I know my lenses well enough now that I can just like, I know the number, I guess. But yeah, no, I don't know. I guess not really.
Question on light pollution. On the light pollution map, are the gray areas dark skies?
Yes, that is a good question. I don't remember if there's a legend on there, but I think there is somewhere in one of the little menu things that you can expand that shows you like the different levels of the light pollution. So yeah, the darker like gray areas are very, very dark, and then the light bright colors are light pollution.
Yeah, people see us like on the East Coast where we don't have to worry about forest fires and the stuff that's going on. I feel like a lot of that is more out in the West Coast. And then we go out, you take a trip to the West. And I think my last two trips, one was to Zion and forget where the other one was, but there was wildfires, wind blowing all the way across. And it's like I had to work with just constant haze. Does that
Mhm.
throw how much does haze really? I mean, I didn't know if it's like for me, I always assume it's user error, like could have used a filter, I'm not doing something right. Does it really play that much of a role?
It does, definitely. And there isn't really a good filter that will filter out like specifically wildfire haze. One of the cool things about Windy is there is a wildfire and like a smoke layer, so you can see all of that as well. That's a good thing to note though, the wildfires, because that definitely is something that will block your view of the Milky Way. Like you can use night sky filters to like remove some of the cast, like the yellows, but not really, they won't really remove like that haze, unfortunately. So yeah, that is
Mm,
something to keep in mind if you are coming out west in the summer, later in the summer, because wildfires are definitely a thing.
That's the thing. Yeah, we don't think about that over here.
Hmm.
One last question we'll sneak in. Focusing. Focusing seems to be the big thing today. Did you try using Batinov mask for focusing?
Oh, I don't know if I know what that is.
Yeah,
What is
I
that?
don't either.
Is
Okay.
that
Well,
like one
that
of
makes
the filters that like has the little like cross on it? I don't know. I have used those though, and those are helpful. But I don't know what was it again?
Batinov mask. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. This is not my world, so I'm like maybe Autumn knows.
Yeah, I'm not
There we
sure.
go. It is a device used to focus small astronomical telescopes accurately from Wikipedia. Thank you, Danny.
Oh, okay.
All right.
Well, I
Well,
wonder if that's a similar thing then as the one filters that like have the little like almost like star thing that you line up. I'm not sure. I'll have to look into that because no, I don't use that.
there you go.
Should I
Gives
be?
us both something. I know. As soon as we log off, I'm like, all
I
right, I'm gonna look this up and see what it
know, me
is.
too.
Awesome. Well, Autumn, always great having you on. Thank you as usual. Of course, a huge thank you to Sony for hosting and to all of our viewers out there. Thank you guys for tuning in, getting your questions in. That's it. It's all we got for right now. Another edition of the B&H virtual event space now in the books. Catch y'all next time.
Bye.